Welcome to Midweek, Experiments in Faithfulness. This is a weekly facilitated spiritual practice with a Quaker flavor and an experimental ethos. My name is Kat Green, and I'm a program fellow here at Beacon Hill Friends House, which is a Quaker center for learning and action and a residential community of about 20 people who live according to Quaker values. Tonight, we have Sofia Post with the practice Mapping Out a Happiness Plan. We will be planning out our happiness for the next few months like we would a business proposal, an investment plan, or a career change outline. We will be paying as much attention to our personal and spiritual fulfillment as we routinely do to other external concerns. Now, I'm excited to introduce you to Sofia. Sofia is a Beacon Hill Friends House program fellow studying exercise science at Simmons University. They have a passion for wellness and applying creative ways to achieve a holistically well life. Again, welcome. We're happy you've joined us. Sofia, it's all yours.
We live in a world where we're constantly planning for things. And I feel like usually those plans are business or travel. And I feel like they rarely are meant for joy. So if you sort of think of your life, I like the analogy of a cake recipe. And the cake in this case is sort of your well-being and your happiness and what brings you the most joy in life. The ingredients are what you do to fulfill yourself, right? To achieve your happiness. And some of these ingredients might be trivial or annoying things like self-care that isn't a priority for us, but is necessary for us to be fulfilled. And the goal is to sort of optimize our time and create an efficient way for us to prioritize our happiness. And I sort of like to think of it as preventing regret. So like allowing yourself to commit to being happy. So in order to create an actionable plan, we need to identify what's making us happy. And it can be big or small. So it can be a goal that you're reaching or something that you want to do every day because you know it makes you happy, but you aren't making the time for it, or something new that you want to try that you think could be really fulfilling for you. And for the next few minutes, I have some questions that I would like to take us through that can help us identify what it is that makes us happy and how we can incorporate it into our lives and all the other things that can make it easy for us to create a comprehensive happiness plan. So I'm going to stay on this slide for a minute, but I'm just going to introduce the questions. Okay, that's fine. The questions are, and then I will reshare my screen. What brings me joy and happiness? How often am I doing them, or how often would I like to be doing them? Versus how often they're actually happening. And how can I plan for these things, incorporate them into my life? What can I do to make it more of a priority? It's okay. And this isn't included in the map specifically, but is there anything in the way? So this can be something financial, logistic. Is there something that is preventing you from incorporating this or achieving this? And then the last question that I would like to finish with and talk about in a group is how to create accountability and making it so that this is something that you're really committing to, whether that accountability is through communicating with someone else on what this plan is and how you want to do it, or just planning to do it with someone else. So, committing to go for a walk with a friend every week so that you're going to have an hour each week of being outside if your goal is to find more happiness outside and being in nature. So again, these questions are sort of off the top of the head. What makes you happy? Do you want to be doing these things each day, each week, each month? How often, if these are already things that you're doing, are these things actually happening? And then how can you plan for these things? What's in the way and how can you accommodate for that? And then how can you be accountable? So let's go ahead and spend the next few minutes thinking about these first 5 questions. And I have them up here. So I'd like for us to think about what makes us happy, how often we can incorporate these things, how we can prepare to incorporate these things, and what we need to include them in our lives. And then we'll come back together and talk about accountability. So before we talk about accountability, is anyone willing to share some of the things that they wrote down? I think specifically what you identified that makes you happy, maybe how often you want to do it, and sort of what's getting in the way versus how you're preparing for it. We have a really sophisticated operation going on here. I was actually going to share an experience that I had that I feel like talks about this, but my mother knows the story and she is here. A few weeks ago, I was home and I was in the mountains of upstate New York and I was skiing a bunch, and I told myself, okay, I'm going to go. And I'm not going to share that insight because I honestly don't remember exactly what it was, but I will say, I will say what I interpreted as, which was, if I had said, okay, I'm going to go skiing with my friend and we're going to meet at the mountain and it's going to be at this time. And if I had woken up, if that was the circumstances of the situation, and I had woken up an hour and a half later than I anticipated, I would have just called or texted that friend and said, hey, I woke up a half hour late. I'm sorry, I'm going to be an hour late, right? Like, it's not that big of a deal. And I'm going to try to connect this to your question. It might be a little far-fetched, but I think that there is a lot of challenges, specifically in our society, of like making time to be productive. And when you're not doing things that are inherently productive or feel inherently productive based on how society is labeling them, it's really hard to give yourself that space. And with the skiing incident, right? Like, skiing is sort of a silly sport, but I get a lot of joy out of it. And I know a lot of other people that I can connect with that get a lot of joy out of it. And if I'm doing something that's bringing me joy, that's giving me fuel to then spread the joy and the light and whatever is feeling makes me feel good in myself. And then when I go and do the things that are challenging or sort of like the work things that we feel are productive and make us good contributors to society, it makes it so that that part of our productivity and that plan that we give ourselves can also include this sense of joy and happiness that we have gotten from other things. Does that answer your?
Yeah.
Cool. So I just wanted to share that because I feel like it's relevant. And I also wanted to sort of add, before we continue sharing, that I again think like a lot of this it's hard to say like, oh, this really tangible thing is making me happy. Like, it can be a cup of tea or a good song or a walk on the beach or something. And it doesn't have to be something that you can readily identify. It's easier with a map to like write it down and have a word. But I think this can also be applied to like things that are more theoretical, but that allow us to cultivate happiness and joy so that we can continue sort of the like a trickle down like explosion of light from all of us in all the other things that we do. So, yeah. There's stuff going on in the chat that is cool. Donna said, I find the weather, my health, and COVID prevent me from doing many of the things that give me joy. Okay. Sorry, Donna. Yeah, it's not easy to think about this. Like, I think it's probably harder than like a concrete business plan that we create for our boss, right? Like, it's easier to say like, I'm giving you a task, accomplish the task, because making happiness a task is not something that's graceful. That's a really good place to be. I feel like I also like to think of it sort of as like, especially when you're doing things that are small, but like can bring you a lot of happiness. Like that's a privilege to like be really grateful for. And I think like, I like to remember those things of like, oh, like, why am I sitting here doing nothing? And I'm like, because I have the time and space to, and that's amazing that I have that opportunity to do that. And like, that's something that I've continually reminded of myself, especially during the pandemic. I think this has been beaten around the bush, but it's like so relevant now to just allow that space to exist and to get comfortable in it, because I think it was lost. The irony of the presentation is it was like a business plan. And I like this idea of making your happiness a plan, because it sort of like dissolves this notion that we have of it being like, you have to plan for things, and like makes it so that, oh, I'm going to include in my plan this concept of like bringing myself joy and give myself the space that like humans naturally had before we gave ourselves all these priorities and things that felt like a requirement, but are actually not at all. All the gratification we need is from like doing and accomplishing things outside of ourselves. But I feel like we're both separating that and also just sort of congealing it in a giant pot of things, like the cake that is you. And allowing it to be like, okay, yes, I'm going to have this job and I'm going to work these things and I'm going to complete these tasks for, you know, the livelihood that I need to survive. But I'm also going to say, I can use these same tools that have sort of taken over my life to just extend it and include myself and prioritize the things that I need. A lot of times I think accountability is related to productivity, and like, it's hard to associate or disassociate that. But I think we can be productive in, you know, being out in nature and making art and listening to music. Yeah, I hope you all feel like you have some tools to think about these things. I feel like it's really hard to take all these very like large theoretical concepts and make it like a strategic line from like point A to point B. Because there's also that whole other notion of like, okay, I'm not going to wake up at 7. I'm going to wake up at 8:30, and allowing yourself to adapt to those changes, even if they're like mistakes that you make or mistakes that someone else makes, right? Like, it's important to acknowledge that like, okay, it's not going to be a straight line from, I know what makes me happy. I know how often I'm going to do it and how I'm going to prepare for it. And I just know how this works, because it's not always how it works. Yeah, I had made a note in the slide that I didn't go over about considering whether or not how you're treating and planning and talking and being with yourself is how you would want other people to be with themselves and how you would want other people to be with you. And I think happiness is directly associated to that concept, and how we treat ourselves and how we treat other people is then tied into how we talk to ourselves.
Sophia, thank you so much for that practice. That was really lovely. And I especially love the reminder that putting ourselves first isn't selfish. It is, necessary for us to make our way through this world sometimes.